Dave Filoni, A Cautionary Tale. How Not to Write. The first thing we need to talk about, and I think one of the most important things we need to talk about is execution. The order of events, the logic of events, the logic of interaction and exchange. So whatever the event, the environment, the interaction, the dialogue, whatever the case is, your scene has to make sense. So I want to introduce this idea of order of execution, and it's more of a computer science term, but order of execution is really, really important depending on the syntax and the hierarchy of syntax inside a function, inside a block of code. Order of execution is going to really dictate the output, the result of what you want your computer to do, what you want your computer to read, in terms of flow and function and architecture. So I would say this is pretty important with writing too, really in any art form. But order of execution in writing, I'll put it this way. If the events leading up to the scene don't make sense, or if the events are completely unnecessary, don't include that scene. So let's talk about the example in The Siege of Mandalore. And that is Ahsoka's meeting with Anakin. It actually doesn't make sense. Her meeting Anakin in person after a couple of years of not being together, or a year or so, her meeting with him actually doesn't make sense when given the context. And here's what I mean. We see them meet after an exchange between their ship, or wherever they are, and his ship. So there's a transmission. There's a holographic transmission. And then they say, okay, we have to talk. Bo-Katan is laying out to Kenobi what she wants. She wants this joint operation with the Republic so she can take down Maul, or take him out, and renew order in Mandalore. Well, if you think about it, the scene between the hologram of Ahsoka and her actually meeting Anakin in person is actually pretty urgent in timing. There's this stress, like we don't have time. I mean, even Bo-Katan and her character says every second we waste gives Maul the opportunity to slip away. We can't waste our time on this. Now, if that's true, and I think it is, I mean, there is urgency in the matter. There is urgency in the scene. If that's true, then why couldn't all this have been resolved in a simple conference call, a holographic conference call? Everything that Bo-Katan and Ahsoka relate to Kenobi and relate to Anakin, albeit, a couple holographic images of the city of Mandalore, all that could have explained. It could have been explained in a single transmission, a single conference call. Why this is important to bring up is Obi-Wan ends up saying no, and he walks out of the room. He will consult with the council, but not immediately, and she's wanting this immediate reaction, this immediate response, and this immediate help. And then she is huffy, and she walks out too. So there's actually no real resolve to the conversation anyway, meaning that conversation could have just as easily been that conversation could have easily been taken care of through this transmission between the Ahsoka's holographic image and Anakin, in that room. Not that we needed to see it played out like that in a film, but in a real life situation, when the conversation didn't go anywhere, well, then why couldn't have it been just between a transmission from one ship to the next? It would have been faster. Bo-Katan would have had her answer much faster. She probably was resentful that she wasted so much time getting to that point where Anakin and Kenobi were. So the sense of urgency, like we can't waste any time, well, then you should have had a conference call. Why didn't you? Well, the reason was we had to bring Anakin and Ahsoka back together for a reunion. So that was the only reason. Now, one could argue, well, Michelle, wait a second. Maybe a transmission with this kind of information is dangerous. Maybe it's not safe. They are at war after all. Maybe an enemy droid would intercept this exchange. I want to actually bring it to the table. That can't even be a risk to begin with, because if you're talking about Star Wars, wars in space or wars among the stars, armies, enemy, ally, they would have had radio technology that, whether encrypted or secure from interception, and enemy interception, they would have had a way to communicate from ship to ship, from location to location safely. If you don't have safe radio communication, obviously there can be interception technology and techniques, of course, but by and large, if ships can't safely communicate to one another for tactical reasons, then you kind of destroyed the world building of Star Wars. I think it's perfectly legitimate. It's perfectly reasonable to say that the transmission would be safe, and that Bo-Katan could have had this whole thing resolved much quicker, much more quickly than traveling all the way to meeting them. So really, the event of Ahsoka actually meeting Anakin again in person doesn't make sense when given that context. Now, people say, well, wait a second. She gets her army, she gets her troops, and they go to Mandalore. But as I've said in my streaming, my streaming a couple weeks ago, and I've said it on my fixed video, my fixed commentary, all that is quite contrived, because it's Anakin haphazardly suggesting that she be given an army, even though she's not a Jedi. And I've covered all that, so we don't need to go into that. But it's haphazard. It's kind of careless. It's reckless, erratic decision making on Anakin's part. So the whole thing of her getting that army to begin with is rather contrived. So the scene, any scene of your books, of your comics, whether it's a visual piece of fiction or a novel or short story, every scene has to make sense. In the narrative and the plot, every scene has to make sense. The events leading up to the scene, the character exchanges and the motives and the actions leading up to that scene has to make sense. I'm in the process of editing for a final time before sending it to a proofreader. I'm in the process of editing all these chapters of the first installment of my space opera. And there are 2 chapters I've run into, and I'm sad. I'm sad to say I have to change them. These scenes are so cool. I wish I could keep them in the plot. But now that I've written all this stuff ahead of time, and now that I've established a lot more of the world building and what has taken place in that kind of world, these 2 chapters with these scenes, as cool as these scenes are, they just don't make sense in the plot. They don't make sense in the narration, and they certainly don't make sense in the world building. And I don't even think they make physical sense in the way of how space travel would work. So I actually have to not really cheapen the scene, but I have to not cheapen, I shouldn't say that word. I have to modify the scene, or the 2 scenes, the 2 chapters, where it's not as cool. It's not as cool, and I'm kind of sad, but I have to do it because it's not going to make sense otherwise. So have your scenes make sense with everything leading up to that scene, and it's all about execution. So whatever the event, the environment, the exchange between characters, the scene has to make sense. So remember, order of execution for flow and function.